My name is Anna Gluckstein. I'm a teacher in Hackney and a member of Haringey Socialist Workers' Party, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this very important meeting on Palestine, a revolutionary struggle. The way the meeting will run is I will introduce each speaker as we go, and they will speak for about 10 minutes each. Then there will be time for questions and contributions. Because of the size of the room, it will be a slip system. So you just put your hand up and one of the people in the pink t-shirts will grab the slip and hopefully you'll get a chance to speak. I'd like to start with a statement from, Shahad Abu Salama, who unfortunately can't be here today. She's not well, but she has sent a statement to this conference. And she says the following: "Dear comrades, I wish you a great panel discussion today from Sheffield and really sorry I couldn't be with you. I'm sorry not to be present today alongside two such powerful advocates of the Palestinian national liberation cause as Ilan Pape and Lowkey. I want to make a few remarks which I hope can advance the discussion here today. The Palestinian struggle has no borders. The brunt of Israel's assault is in my city of birth, Gaza, which has been under siege since 2007 and periodically subject to Israel's brutal acts of mowing the laws, maiming and killing thousands of innocents and destroying its infrastructure. It is in the Nakab where Bedouin villages are being evicted and their homes bulldozed. It is in Sheikh Jarrah in occupied Jerusalem and Masafa Yatta, southern Hebron, where Israel is dispossessing Palestinian families to make way for Jewish settlers. This is the mode of operation of settler colonialism. The elimination of the indigenous people, a process that has left traumatic traces on my family since the founding of the Israeli state atop our ethnic cleansing. This would not be possible without the West's complicity in Israel's military repression within all the areas of historic Palestine. But that repression extends to Palestinians and their allies to here in the West, including in the UK. I can illustrate this with the history of my own family. While my father first experienced 2-month imprisonment at the age of 14 when Israel occupied the Gaza Strip in 1967, he was again persecuted when he was 19 and endured 13 years of captive resistance in the Israeli prison system before his release in 1985. 13 years is only not that long compared to his original sentence of 7 life sentences plus 10 years, which was suspended as part of a deal struck to exchange Palestinian and Israeli prisoners. I can't recall my father ever showing regret or sorrow for the years stolen from him. He is a revolutionary. And as a Palestinian refugee, revolutionary thinking has been an organic part of his upbringing. He was born to a dispossessed family from Beit Jerja 4 years after Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, an event we call the Nakba catastrophe. He grew up in Jabalia refugee camp, where Israeli colonial oppression defined every aspect of daily life. Israeli soldiers had also shot his grandfather and cousin. On the 30th of November 1972, the prosecutor called on the court to wage a serious war against terror and impose the harshest punishment on my father and his comrades, who were all charged with belonging to the Marxist-leaning Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Especially bitter is the fate of anyone suspected of holding communist values. Langer observed, according to her, the prosecutor claimed to be showing lenience in not asking for death sentences. Before issuing his verdict, the judge allowed my father and his comrades to say their parting words, but warned, "I don't want to hear political speeches." His comrade, Abdel Rahman, now the husband of my maternal aunt, said there was no point since they did not recognise Israeli jurisdiction. A riot erupted inside the courtroom and the defendants were prohibited from making further comments. In the middle of all this, my father shouted his belief in the, quote, triumphant power of the revolution to achieve justice for them and Palestine. After 13 years of imprisonment, my father was released on the 21st of May 1985. Following a long negotiation, a deal had been struck for Israel to release 1,150 prisoners in return for the 3 Israelis that Palestinian resistance held captive. My father was included in the deal and was set free at the age of 33, making my family possible. Fast forward to now. And I've been confronting another front in the repression of the Palestinian struggle, as has my brother in Germany. I am not equating my experience with that of my father. He had to put up with much worse than I. My point is to illustrate how the repression of the Palestinian struggle is global and very much alive and kicking in the so-called liberal democracies of the West. I've recently completed my PhD studies looking at the historical representations of Palestinian refugees in colonial, humanitarian and Palestinian documentary films. In the last year, I had a teaching post. As a result of my public statements, I've been vilified by Zionist groups and publications, including the Jewish Chronicle, Jewish News, and Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. They often described me as a daughter of a convicted terrorist and were dismissive of my family and own experiences surviving many of Israel's crimes since 1948. None of this is surprising or shocking, given their ideological interest to silence me. But it is the response of my university that should be of concern, because it is an institution that is supposed to embody freedom of speech and critical thinking. Sheffield Hallam University had suspended my teaching without any prior notice, pressured by its recent adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism that obfuscates the former with anti-Zionism, through ideologically charged examples to protect Israel from the charge of racism against the Palestinians and accountability. The definition doesn't want us to state the obvious and call Israel racist. To a third-generation stateless refugee who survived multiple of Israel's indiscriminate attacks against the Palestinian people in the besieged Gaza Strip, it goes without a question that Israel is inherently racist, with settler, colonial and apartheid values and practices whose brutal manifestations nothing can disguise. Nonetheless, the university bowed to pressure from the UK Education Minister Gavin Williamson, who threatened regulatory action and suspension of funding streams for institutions that don't adopt this ideological state weapon by the end of 2020. Despite fierce opposition to the IHRA definition, including amongst anti-Zionist Jews, many universities adopted it, including Sheffield Hallam, which excluded Palestinians from discussions around its adoptions, but included a member of UK's Lawyers for Israel and claimed to have a transparent and independent discussion. Subsequently, I became a test case for its application, which further revealed the racist nature of such a definition, embodied in its silencing of the Palestinian experience under Israel's racist systems of settler colonialism and apartheid. Despite the university's promise not to limit legitimate debate and criticism on Israel and Palestine, its first member to be framed under the IHRA framework was Palestinian. Yet I have been suspended, cleared by an internal investigation now after further scurrilous attacks by people who don't know me and I don't know. I recently became again subjected to another investigation by my university with no apparent care for my well-being. Israel's repression of the Palestinians is not sealed off from the rest of the world by its apartheid wall. The connections are many, and those chains of complicity have been exposed by apartheid off-campus student campaign and Palestine Action, which has been targeting Elbit Systems, one of many arms dealers that have headquarters and factories in Britain, despite its horrible record of profiting from Israeli war crimes against the Palestinians. The ideological battle that maintains Western support for Israel rests on perpetuating militarism, racism, and particular Islamophobia, and in the UK, the colonial legacy that have marked British institutions with systemic racism have been a fertile and supportive ground. I will conclude by pointing out the obvious. To be a consistent anti-racist means opposing Zionism, which is one of the principal driving forces behind Islamophobia. You cannot stand up to racism and be silent on Zionism. Okay, I'm now going to introduce Ilan Pape. Just to say, sorry, Lowkey has got COVID symptoms, so he is going to be here, and he's going to be here from Zoom. I should have said that at the beginning, but as I say, it will be Zoom. So Ilan Pape is a professor, a historian at the University of Exeter. He is an author of Our Vision for Liberation, which he'll be speaking on later, and we are absolutely delighted to have him here at our event. Ilan.
Thank you. Is it working? Yes. It's great to see so many of you here today. I don't know how many of you are aware, I'm sure quite a few of you are aware, that not far away from here, on 31 Mile End Road, a certain campaign of advocacy and lobbying began in the United Kingdom, which has changed the face of the Anglo-Jewish community, the left's attitude towards Zionism in Israel, and altogether a campaign that contributed both to the occupation of Palestine by Britain and the colonization of Palestine by Britain and the making of Palestine a Jewish state by Britain. In 31 Mile Road in 1898, in front of 10,000 enthusiastic, mainly Anglo-Jews, Theodor Herzl, for the first time, appeared in London. He had two clear messages that he will repeat 2 years later in the same hall, 31 Mile End Road, in the Fourth Zionist Congress in 1900. The two messages were very clear. One, the idea of colonizing Palestine is not directed at the Anglo-Jewish community. He said, we don't expect you to leave Britain. In fact, we admire Britain as a democracy. There's no need to call upon the Jews of Britain to leave and colonize another country. By the way, he was using the verb colonize. He was talking about Zionism as colonialism. He was talking about the Jewish settlements as colonies. All kinds of items in our vocabulary that if we use them today, we are immediately branded as anti-Semites. And the first message was, I'm coming here to ask you to support the colonization of Palestine by the Jews of Eastern Europe. That was the first message. The second message was, I know how many of you, which was very true about the 10,000 people who attended his talk, I know many of you are enchanted by socialism and Marxism. I know many of you live in Whitechapel and other areas of East London and you lead a very poor life. I know many of you are part of the working class of Britain. And you may think that an international socialist revolution would help to solve what he called the Jewish problem, namely the issue of anti-Semitism. But I ask you to see that the two projects of Zionism and socialism are not incompatible. And he left this legacy to the very young English Zionist Federation and other advocacy groups for the Zionist movement, and they worked relentlessly and hard, first of all, to see whether they can really reconcile a socialist viewpoint and support for the Zionist colonization in Palestine. And roughly, I would say, in the 1920s, definitely in the early 1930s, they realized that true socialists in this country, true members of the Communist Party in this country, including members of the Anglo-Jewish community, saw a stark contradiction between supporting the colonization of Palestine and subscribing to socialist or Marxist ideas. At that point, the Zionist lobby changed its orientation and its effort. And it began to try and make people believe to prioritize the Zionist colonization over socialist ideals and aspirations. Their greatest success was in the 1950s. Some of you may even, most of you not. I don't see very much how young you are, but I do remember. In the 1950s, the greatest success was the creation of the Labor Friends of Israel in an annual conference of the Labour Party in Brighton, led by all the leaders of the Labour Party, at the time, the leaders, not the rank and file, the leaders, which have given unconditional support, including the TUC, to the idea of Israel, totally ignoring the Nakba of 1948, totally disregarding the military rule imposed on the Palestinians in Israel, and praising Israel as a haven of socialism and egalitarian politics. It's not surprising that in those years, if you wanted to create some sort of a pro-Palestinian advocacy group, you had to go either to the Conservative Party or to the Liberal Party. In fact, some people in the Labour Party who were pro-Palestinians moved to the Liberal Party, where it was easier to talk about the Palestinian refugees' right of return and to expose the criminal policies of Israel. Now, I know many things have changed after 1967, and many people in the Labour Party and in the TUC began to see the issue in different eyes, probably because so many people visited occupied Palestine after 1967, and as we know, visiting the occupation, seeing it with your own eyes, make you understand the reality of Zionism, the nature of the Israeli policies, and you don't need to read anything. You just have to be there for a few minutes on the ground to understand it. And then we can see a shift. Undoubtedly, we can see a shift. But we are not there yet in the British left in the most liberal definition of the term. And the fruits of the advocacy that began in this road, Mile End Road in 1900, is still impacting the ability of those who call themselves part of the left to understand that Zionism and the State of Israel contradicts everything that we should believe as human beings, socialists, communists, and humanists. This is a project that is built on dispossession, ethnic cleansing, oppression, apartheid, and all these practices that still continue as we speak today can really not allow anyone with a universal perspective of a just world to find any excuse to support this state, its policies, or condone its ideology. Now, the left, especially the left in the Arab world, has two roles to play. And I'm saying in the Arab world because I don't want to appear as someone who understands enough about the left in Europe or in Britain. But I definitely feel on solid ground when I'm talking about the left in the Arab world. The left in the Arab world has two different missions. One that it fulfills while still struggling against Zionist occupation, colonization, and oppression. That's one role. And the second role, it has to think and rethink its role in a liberated Palestine, in a decolonized Palestine, that hopefully would be part of a decolonized Arab world. Because as you know, in so many parts of the Arab world, we are still not seeing the full decolonization, and we are still in the winter of post-colonialism that does not allow freedom and social justice for everyone living in the region. It's easier to define the first role, while the occupation still continues, while the oppression still continues. You can align yourself with moral forces, political forces. They may not share exactly your vision for the future. This is why in May 2021, for 11 days, members of Hizb al-Sha'ab, the People's Party of Palestine, members of the Israeli Communist Party, members of the various Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which are left organizations, stood alongside members of the Hamas, the Jihad, the Fatah, and maybe a lot of other young people who don't necessarily have a clear affiliation or party identification. And this unity was so impressive that we are still breathing it today in 2022 when we feel that we need to draw on optimism and resilience, given the fact that the reality on the ground has not yet changed. I will end by hinting to the role in the decolonized Palestine, because you cannot disconnect your vision of the future from your action in the present. The left in the Arab world made many historical mistakes. It also contributed very significantly, in a very positive way, to the life of people. But one cannot ignore its mistakes. And one cannot repeat its mistake when you think about the decolonized Palestine, because it influences the way you behave today. Palestine before imperialism and Palestine before Zionism, like the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean, had great respect for group identities, for sect identities. People were able to navigate without any problem between universal values, tradition, and loyalty to a group or to a sect or to a certain cultural way of life. The left in the 60s and the 70s thought that these traditional solidarities were an obstacle for a better future. It was wrong. It was not. And it is not today. Part of what we are trying to do in what is called the Mashraq, and with this I will end, the Eastern Mediterranean, is to imagine a decolonized world where we are not seeing the past as a primitive part of our history, and we're not seeing Europe or the West as an inspiration for good, and we are willing to relate to our own roots and to our own traditions with a strong commitment for social justice and economic justice, redefine socialism and the left for the 21st century, hopefully in a decolonized and liberated Palestine and the Arab world. Thank you.
I'm just going to read this announcement before we move on to our next speaker. So Hawiya, the Palestinian, I hope I'm saying that right, the Palestinian dance company, which Shahad is part of, are performing in the culture tent after this session at 1 p.m. So our next speaker doesn't really need an introduction. It's Lowkey. He is, yeah, there we go. Yeah, he speaks for Palestinians, he speaks for people from Grenfell, he speaks against injustice where he sees it. So Lowkey, welcome, and over to you.
I apologize for not being there. I have been unwell. I can confirm that I tested negative for COVID, which is great. To start off with, I would like to state my solidarity with the striking members of UCU at Queen Mary's University who have been threatened with deduction of 100% of their pay for going on strike. That is something that absolutely we must organize against, because if that precedent can be set on a micro level, it could possibly be rolled out on a macro level against others undertaking industrial action. So maximum solidarity to all of those at Queen Mary's. So to start with, I think it's important that we outline what exactly happened in the Unity Intifada, in the last sort of spectacular violence that we saw Israel carry out. I mean, of course, the attritional and the daily, more quiet violence is carried out all the time, often outside the earshot of the masses and away from media coverage. But just to start with, I think it's important to make clear the way in which the May 2021 war differed from the previous wars that we've seen over the last few years. So for starters, the parameters of Israel's rationality were restrained because of you, because of us, because of the Palestinians, and because of several factors, which I hope to make clear here. So what was achieved was a paralysis of business as usual. The cost of Israel's massive demonstration of violence was made absolutely clear. And really, it seemed untenable for Israel's economy to withstand an extended period of killing. In the past, we've seen 2014, over 2,000 people killed by the Israelis in Gaza. We saw in 2008, 2009, Operation Castle, 1,400 people killed. Well, the reason that less people were killed this time is because they were held back. And part of that was the achievement of the Palestinian resistance in stopping flights from coming in to Ben Gurion. It was also the fact that the Israeli military as a reserve army meant that it had to take people out of its economy. And so that, in tandem with the strike and fairly widespread ungovernability of Palestinians, it contributed to a fall in the shekel. Now, what you have is a war, at least in the media sphere, against this idea that the Palestinians have the right to protect themselves. Now, the right of armed resistance that the Palestinians have, it's demonized massively. The US government, the UK government, the Israeli government, the EU, all of them designate these organizations that pursue armed resistance against Israel as terrorist organizations. But those governments, when put together, in the US, ostensibly, the government represents 331 million people. The UK government supposedly represents 67 million people. The Israeli government supposedly represents 9 million people. The EU supposedly represents 450 million people. Okay, but altogether, that's only 861 million people being represented by governments who designate Palestinian armed resistance in such a way. When we look at the rest of the world, we look at the 8.5 million people in Switzerland. They are represented by a government who does not define Palestinian armed resistance as terrorism. You look at the government of Pakistan, you look at the government of Turkey, the government of China, the government of Russia, the government of Iran, the government of Venezuela. And far, far more people are represented by political classes that do not designate Palestinian resistance as terrorism. Over 1 billion people easily are represented by such governments. Also, the important thing to point out is that several UN General Assembly resolutions have it that, you know, for instance, UN Resolution 3246 has it that Palestinians have the right to liberate themselves through foreign occupation, through armed struggle. So it's really important that that point is made very clearly. Now, when we have the recent situation with the resistance in Palestine, in Gaza, getting hold of 9K-32 Strela 2 surface-to-air missiles, now there's a slightly more risky situation for Israeli drones specifically. And, you know, it's only a matter of time before that starts to play out in the way that Israel is able to apply its violence against Palestinians. But in a way, an also significant part of what changed the balance in 2021 was the Palestinians within the state of Israel. So these, you know, are over 1 million people that suffer from a plurality of alienations. According to Adala, there are over 50 laws within the Israeli state that impose inequality between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel. The wages of Jewish citizens of Israel are generally 35% higher than Palestinian citizens of Israel. Infant mortality, I mean, these figures are from the late 90s. So I would be interested to see an updated figure on this particular one, is that Palestinian infant mortality is double for Palestinian citizens of Israel in comparison to Jewish citizens of Israel. 50% of Palestinians in the Israeli state live below the poverty line. The top occupational categories, you've only got about 10% of Palestinian citizens that work in them, though still almost 50% of the pharmacists in Israel are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. So when a situation like May 2021 comes around, you see just one day of striking causing quite significant damage to the Israeli economy. So, for example, the Israel Builders Association said that almost 65,000 Palestinian workers went on strike over one day. And that led to a loss of 130 million shekels. That's around $40 million, just literally in one day being taken out of the Israeli economy. And the vice president of the Builders Association said that, and these were his words, "We cannot build without them." You also had the transportation ministry stating that almost 1,000 drivers, which was the 10% of the bus drivers in the Israeli state, also went on strike on the same day. And that led to 300 journeys being cancelled. There is a variety of pressure points within the way Israeli society is arranged. There has been across the last 20 to 30 years a bid to push Palestinian citizens of Israel out of the agricultural sector, but there still remains, and many of them into the service and retail economy, but there's still a large amount of pressure points at which you see significant vulnerability within the arrangement of the Israeli state. And the question is, how can the cost of these assertions of violence be increased? For example, you saw at one point the mayor of Lid attempt to call in the Israeli military directly into Lid to handle the ungovernability of the local Palestinian population. And what happened is the Israeli military, as far as I understand, could not extend to that point. So, while there are 1,500 Palestinians, citizens of Israel arrested throughout that period, we also saw that there were limitations in terms of what Israel was actually able to do and how far it could go. Now, another part of preventing a bigger massacre, more in line with what we saw in previous years, was what happened also in places like this country. So you saw Palestine Action shut down the Elbit factory in Leicester. Now, remember, Elbit is Israel's largest arms company. Previously, at the time of May 2021, it had 10 sites across the country. Now, during this, the Gaza campaign, you saw 6 consecutive days that Elbit factory was shut down by Palestine actionists. And do you know what happened next? The local community came out to support them. And do you know what happened next? The police tried to get the fire brigade to remove them. And do you know what happened next? The fire brigade refused to remove them. And the FBU issued a brilliant statement in solidarity with those people exercising their right to protest. What else you saw was port workers in Italian cities of Naples and Livorno refusing to load ships with weapons that were due for the apartheid entity. You saw an emergency sale and export of over $700 million worth of weapons by Joe Biden to the apartheid state. So what we see here is the organized bottom-up pushing back on all of these things. And I am happy to give you the news that since then, Palestine Action, in tandem with the local communities, have not only been successful in shutting down the Oldham factory for a subsidiary of Elbit Systems, Ferranti Technologies. Elbit were forced to sell it at a loss in this country. They acquired it for something like 15 million pounds, and they sold it for 9 million pounds. That was thanks to not only Palestine Action regularly shutting down the Oldham factory, but also the local community coming out week in, week out for 30 weeks in a row, doorstepping people in the area and giving them flyers, telling them what Elbit were about, setting up stalls in the center of town to show people what Elbit were about. And it's not just Oldham. Just in the last few weeks, it has been confirmed that Elbit Systems, Israel's largest arms company, has abandoned its headquarters, its office in London, thanks to the campaign by Palestine Action. In 2021 May, you had 10 sites where Israeli arms were being manufactured in this country. Now you only have 8. And that is thanks to continued, sustained, organized resistance. Now the question has to be here, when you have the F-16, which featured heavily in the campaign against Gaza last year, having its HUD technology, its target selection technology made by BAE Systems in this country, most likely, one has to wonder, how is it that we have unions that 10 years ago, their members voted for BDS, but yet it still has not been implemented? And one has to wonder, are some of these contraptions and these weapons being made in this country by workers who are part of unions that voted for BDS, their membership voted for BDS, but yet it has not been implemented yet? So it would be massively important now to call on Unite, for example, which voted for BDS over 10 years ago, to finally implement BDS. If not now, when? That is the question that remains. And the last point that I really want to make, I'm aware there will be plenty of questions going forward for the other speakers also, is one thing that the Corbyn moment had to give us, but didn't seem to give us, was a criticality about what the Israel lobby is and does in this country. For the past 4, 5, 6 years, many of us have been getting bullied by the Board of Deputies. We have to be absolutely clear. People have been disqualified from political subjectivity in this country, from the right to have anything to do with public politics, thanks to mechanisms that were organized around an organization like the Board of Deputies. Well, in its own trustees report in 2020, post the killing of Corbynism, the Board of Deputies put in their trustees report that they have a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy and strengthened links with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and the IDF. This is how the Israel lobby functions in this country. It has a plethora of front organizations through which it asserts agency, which is about disqualifying the rest of us from being able to support the Palestinians in meaningful ways. There is a lot more to say, but I think it's important to emphasize that for us, the battle is here. We have a role to play in liberating Palestine, and may we continue to play that role and push harder and harder.
Thanks, Lowkey. That was brilliant. So now I'm going to introduce Sophia Beach, a leading member of the Socialist Workers' Party, and she's going to speak for 12 minutes. Thanks, Sophia.
Bit shorter than Ilan, so I've got to move the microphone. Well, thank you, Anna. And I want to start actually by thanking all of the speakers on this panel, from Shahad and her statement, Ilan himself, and of course, Lowkey, which was amazing, despite feeling unwell, that he was still able to zoom in. Because actually it's important that we're all here today, isn't it, to speak out for Palestine. Because just with what Lowkey finished, actually, our movement has been under attack for some years now, From the smears of Jeremy Corbyn to Ken Loach to the newly elected NUS President Shamar. From the clamping down on Palestine societies at universities to the attacks on the boycott, divestment and sanction campaigns. The use of the IHRA definition to target academics and activists. And actually we have to be clear that this is not just an attack on our movement and on solidarity for Palestine, it is an attack on the right to free speech. It is an attack on the right to talk and speak out about racism, colonialism, and apartheid that takes place in Israel. And actually the attempt by the Israeli state, by the Tories, and by the Labour right even here, to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism is not only wrong, but it is dangerous. It is dangerous because it actually lets the real anti-Semites off the hook. People like Viktor Orban, who targets Jews in his own country in Hungary. People like Donald Trump, who spread anti-Semitic tropes and use conspiracy theories against people like George Soros. They are the real anti-Semites in society, not the left. Thank you. So I think we have to be clear, and we have to say it loud. There is nothing anti-Semitic about speaking out against apartheid. There is nothing anti-Semitic about calling out settler colonialism. And there is nothing anti-Semitic about being an anti-Zionist. Actually, it is the anti-racist thing to do. And ever since Zionism was created as a political movement in the late 1800s in Europe, which, Ilan mentioned, there have always been socialist Jews who have stood up and spoken out against Zionism. And actually, I'd like to say that I, along with, I hope they don't mind, the others on the stage, Ilan and Anna, we are proud to be part of that socialist Jewish tradition. And the right, they've always tried to silence us, haven't they, and Palestinian voices. But despite this, despite all of the odds, Palestinians have never submitted to Israeli racism or control, despite the military might of Israel, backed by US aid and propped up by imperialism and the neighboring states. Despite the checkpoints, the demolitions of homes, the racist laws, the unlawful imprisonment, the murder of Palestinian children and journalists like Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot in the head by an Israeli sniper from the IDF while she was wearing a press vest just only a month or so ago. We have to be clear. This was no accident. This was an assassination of one of the loudest Palestinian voices. And where is her justice? There is no justice for her. There is no justice for her family. There is no justice for the people who were attacked the days after, by the IDF on the funeral procession. So for 74 years now, Palestinians have resisted Israeli apartheid. And I want to be clear that we will stand with them for 74 more years if it has to, no matter how long that it takes. Thank you. And it's been mentioned already, but just last year, what Lowkey was speaking about, last year we were reminded of Palestinians' ongoing struggle against apartheid in one of the most inspiring of ways. We saw a global outcry of support for Palestinians against the forced evictions in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, one of the occupied territories. Then the attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the 11-day bombing campaign that then happened in Gaza. And actually, not just from every single corner of historic Palestine, from Haifa, Alder, Jerusalem, Ramallah, Gaza, and West Bank was the Palestinian flag flown, but from every single corner of the world. Here in London, we had the UK's biggest pro-Palestinian demonstration. 200,000 or over 200,000 people took to the streets in support of Palestine. And actually, I think what this showed us and what the movement that was being spoken about May last year showed us is that despite Israel's attempts to erase any aspect of Palestinian identity or nationality, the way they have tried to fragment Palestinians across the world, from those living in the occupied territories to within Israel's borders to the 8 million diaspora, actually what they showed is that they will fight as one. And then on May the 18th, 2021, Gaza and the West Bank joined Haifa, Jaffa, and Alder in a general strike on a scale not seen for decades, causing severe damage to the Israeli economy. And actually it showed the powerful possibilities of joint action between Palestinians on both sides of Israel's apartheid wall. And whilst this is a heroic fight against apartheid, Palestinians will not win alone. It is why we are standing here today, speaking out for Palestine and showing solidarity. But crucially, we have to recognize that what happens in the entire region of the Middle East matters for the Palestinian resistance. Because this is because Israel does not exist in a vacuum. It is tied up in and is essential to the interconnected network of imperialism in the region. A structure which is defined by militarized economies, militarized states. The entire system has to fall for us to get Palestinian freedom, not just apartheid in Israel. Because actually, what happens under al-Sisi in Egypt, it matters. What happens in Syria under Assad, it matters. What happens in Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, it all matters because actually whilst the populations of these countries, the civilians, the working class people, whilst they may stand with Palestinians, their rulers and dictators do not. In Egypt, Egypt is the second biggest receiver of US military aid after Israel. That means Egypt props up and supports what Israel does to Palestinians. So actually, if we see this system as a whole, seeing it as being bound up entirely with each other, and if we want to see it crumble, we have to attack it at its weakest points. And actually, those weakest points do not lie within the borders of Israel. It's got one of the world's biggest militaries. It is backed by international imperialist superpowers. But it has to be said as well that Palestinians also don't exist in a vacuum. I mentioned the 8 million Palestinian diaspora. Palestinians make up the majority of the population in Jordan. There are over 200,000 Palestinians living and working in Lebanon. There are 500,000 Palestinians living in Syria. And it has to be made clear as well that Palestinians living in those countries, they are part of the working class there. They are part of the struggles against the regimes in that country. So I think that whilst we've seen glimpses of amazing resistance over the years, the first Intifada of 1987, where thousands of Palestinians were killed, 300 children murdered, the second Intifada of the 2000s, the siege of Gaza in 2014, the Arab Springs and the Egyptian revolutions in 2011, it's worth noting that the leaders of those revolutions, the whole prehistory of the revolution in Egypt was awash and entirely bound up with solidarity with Palestine because the people who were fighting against the Mubarak regime, they knew that their fight was entirely linked against the apartheid state of Israel. But what we've seen is that we have to go one step further, don't we? We need to really break those chains of the imperialist system and dismantle the apartheid system once and for all. Because actually, if the last 74 years since the Nakba in 1948, when 800,000 Palestinians were brutally and violently displaced from their homes, if the last 74 years have taught us anything, it's that compromise gets us nowhere. I mean, you cannot bargain with a colonialist. It does not happen. So just look, what happened at the peace processes? The Oslo Accords of 1993, which was meant to give Palestinians some sort of level of autonomy, which was a crap deal in the first place, by the way. But what did the Israeli state do? They ripped it up. They ignored it the first chance that they got. And if you look throughout history, compromise has never got working class or oppressed and minority groups anywhere. It's never got any of us nothing in society. And this is exactly what Boris Johnson wants us to do, doesn't it? And the bosses. When you think about the railway strikers that we've heard, or the UCU strikers that here at QM that Lowkey talks about, the bosses, they want us to compromise in the face of strikes and economic crisis. Well, I don't know about you lot. I'm hoping people in this room agree, but I reckon we should compromise no more. Because actually what we need, is real struggle from below. One that takes up the question of Palestinian solidarity and turns its anger against its own rulers. Because actually we have to behead the beast of imperialism, that system that allows Palestine to be colonized. It allows the racism that Palestinians face in their own country, and it allows for the encroachment and infringement and their stolen land. Thanks, Anna. I'm very nearly done, I promise. But also, this is we have to dismantle the entire system. Imperialism doesn't just exist in the Middle East, it exists all across the world, and this is something we've spoken a lot about today, or not just today, across this weekend. And I think to do that, it won't be a surprise when I say this, but to do that, I think we need a revolution, real struggle from below, like Lowkey talks about, grassroots organization, people taking up the question of liberation. And we need a revolution that links freedom for Palestine with freedom for everyone across the world, for all occupied and oppressed people. It's all of our fights. For any of you who were in the opening rally on Friday, Lewis said that borders kill. And he said that it's not a slogan, it's a reality. And he was right when you think about the refugee crisis and the refugees who have died just these last week. But actually the people who know this reality the most are the Palestinians. So actually when we talk about struggling from below, when we talk about fighting, and actually the resistance that we've seen for the last 74 years, I think the people of Palestine, they're up for it. And actually I think if you look at what's going on in Sudan, I think they're up for it. I think a lot of people, us here in this room, I think we're up for that fight against the system. So actually the real question is, what the question is not, is about if we take this fight against the system together. Actually, the real question is about when we do it. So thank you, everyone. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sophia. That was great. Just to make people aware that the QMUCU strikers that Lowkey mentioned will be speaking in this room at 2 o'clock on the meeting about resistance, and there will be a collection for their strike fund. So the way it's going to work is I'll call 2 people up at a time. If there are mobility issues, please let somebody know and we'll get a mic to you. But what we'd like, because it's being recorded, is if you could come to the front. So I'll call 2 people up at a time. The first person to speak is Omar Ashur. Just to say, you'll get 3 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'll tap on the microphone, and after 3 minutes, I'll ask you to stop very politely. And the person after Omar will be Oshin. And while Omar's making his way here, I've got a question from Robin to Ilan Pappé, who says the following: in the current situation, is there any role left for the Israeli left parties in Palestinian liberation? If so, what is it?
Thank you. First of all, thanks a lot to Lowkey, Ilan, and everyone who spoke today, and just generally for setting up this panel. Lowkey touched upon it already, what I was going to say, and you also touched upon it on the fact that it's not just about looking at Palestine as an isolated issue, but from a background, I come from Egypt, and you mentioned that already, how instrumental events taking place in Egypt are. 2 very recent examples of that are the fact that currently the Egyptian military is wiping out the population, the Bedouin population of Sinai, in order to make way for what Israel had planned as the expulsion of those living in Gaza into Sinai, the Sinai desert, to make space for an Israeli occupation of Gaza. And at the same time, Egypt has sold off 2 very key islands to make international waters of the Red Sea Straits to allow Israeli shipping routes to continue uncontrolled by Egypt. So it's very key to look at the whole region and the way that this is all propped up by the global system of imperialism. But it's also an ideological war, because every time we see any form of resistance in those countries, in Palestine, it is in an Islamophobic way demonized, whether to us in the West, whether to those in those countries in occupied Palestine, in Egypt. Armed resistance, as Lowkey mentioned, is a right, whether it's stipulated in UN resolutions or not. UN resolutions were written by the United Nations, the very same United Nations that commissioned the occupation of Palestine. So my point was mainly about the fact that looking at the current state of affairs, We need to see what we do here in the West, the boycott campaigns, the solidarity campaigns, shutting down Elbit systems in the context of one tool in a big toolbox that includes Palestinian armed resistance on the ground and resistance from those oppressed peoples in order to achieve what is inevitable, which is liberation. Thank you.
Thank you. Oisin will be followed by Phil Butlem.
Hi, comrades. I'm Oshin. I'm from Cambridge, SWP. Look, I've grown up. I'm 23. I've grown up in a world where I've been fed up with the current state of affairs. I've been fed up with constant Tory governments attacking on living standards, with racism peddled by the state, with all kinds of miseries that we've had to deal with. And a lot of the time in my life, I felt a bit helpless. I felt like I didn't know what to do, how to organize that, and like I wasn't living in a period of intense resistance. I didn't know the miners' strike that my parents knew. I didn't know these sorts of things. And a lot of the time growing up, I would look abroad. I would look at areas where there were these high levels of struggle and think, wow, you know, this is the inspiration that we need to take. I'd look at the workers' revolution in Egypt, in Sudan, and I'd look at the Palestinian struggle. And I think for many people in this room, they can empathize with that sort of connection that they saw with a Palestinian struggle. Not only is it an incredibly brave resistance against an incredibly brutal national oppression, but also actually the more and more that I've got to know the Palestinian struggle, the more I've seen that it's how deeply it is a class struggle as well. From the revolutionary impoverished masses in the refugee camps of Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and elsewhere, to the striking teachers in the first Intifada who organized their own independent education system underground at a time when Israeli soldiers were arresting children for holding books as a means of resisting the occupation. Is that 1 minute left? To the general strike of 2021. What an incredible example of workers' struggle as well. We think that the RMT strike has changed things. Imagine how it must have felt in Palestine in 2021 at the general strike. And there's a flip side of that class politics, which is what Lowkey was talking about, that victory at Elbit. I think that was incredibly brave resistance, but it was also made possible by that class solidarity, that politics that brought in the FBU, that brought in the working class community around them. And that's what we need more of. We need to bring that class revolutionary politics to every workplace, school, and university. And that's why I joined the SWP, because I think we needed to be in an organization that could have revolutionaries in every place to argue those arguments. Thank you.
A few weeks ago, we had Nakba Day, when there were demonstrations worldwide in London, Washington, even in Tel Aviv. There was one city in the world where there were no legal demonstrations, and that was Berlin. In Berlin, there was a complete ban on all demonstrations on Palestine. A demonstration from the Jewish Voice of Peace in commemoration of the murder of Shirin al-Akleh was also banned by the police. The justification, according to the police spokesman, was these sorts of demonstrations attract Muslims, and Muslims create bother. This is the day-to-day situation in Berlin, in Germany, on Palestine. I've come up before at Marxism to talk about how horrible it was. I do want to end on a message of hope, but just where we are. We've had 7 Palestinian journalists who've been sacked from Deutsche Welle. We have countless room bans. We tried to organize a meeting on how much is it possible to discuss Palestine in Germany as part of an anti-racist festival. We were uninvited from the anti-racist festival, and the rooms were told if the meeting carries on, they will lose their state funding. And so we're in a position where I know you're having problems with bans and things yourself. You don't know half of it. Nonetheless, I think we want to look at why the demonstrations on that day were banned, and look at the year before. The year before, I know it sounds a bit little compared to 200,000 in London. We got 15,000 people demonstration in Berlin. That was 10 times bigger. Yeah. That was 10 times bigger than we mobilized in 2014, which itself was one of the biggest demonstrations we've had. We have a movement now in Germany, which is rising, which is led by Palestinians, young Palestinians, people like Shahd Abu Salama's brother Majed, who are looking a different way of mobilizing from Palestine as we had in the past. In the past, it tended to be we'll mobilize the old Palestinian groups and a few of their friends. They were fairly depressing demonstrations. They were small, they were not lively. Now we have large contingents from Black Lives Matter. We have large numbers of Palestinians, small numbers of Germans, but larger Black numbers, and it's something which is on the rise, and a movement which orientates on the anti-capitalist movement, which orientates on the anti-colonialist movements. It's from all the depressing demonstrations that have been on Palestine in the past, it is a change in direction which was only possible because of the movement, the international movement which we're seeing elsewhere. I think Germany shows two things. One, you've got to persist, you've got to carry on trying, but secondly, we are hoping that we can build a movement where in a few years we're going to be the people who are going to be inspiring you, and that we're going to, together, we're going to free Palestine.
Hi, everyone. So it's been mentioned a bit by Sophia and one of the other speakers, but I just wanted to highlight how brutal the regime has been by focusing on Shireen Abu Akleh's murder. And so I'm sure a lot of people here know who she was, but she was a shining light for people in the Middle East, and her coverage for decades of the plight of the Palestinian people was invaluable to people in the Middle East. So when she was shot, she was wearing a press vest, as Sophia had mentioned, as well as a helmet for protection. And so what the IDF sniper had done was targeted below her ear at the base of her skull in order to kill her. And that's why it was a kill shot. Like, you can't really, argue that it was Palestinian, stray fire. It was a precision shot intended to kill her. And not only that, after the funeral, the hearse carrying her body was also attacked by IDF thugs. And what they did was they removed, the flags, Palestinian flags that were hanging from the hearse. And, they just came and sort of forcefully removed the flags that were hanging from the car. After that, they, as Sophia mentioned, they also attacked the funeral procession, where they started beating people who were carrying her coffin. They weren't even allowed to grieve in peace. It was horrible. And so, even further to that, the Israeli government did what it so often has done, and they lied, saying that she was killed by Palestinian fire. So the atrocities committed by this lying, murderous government are not only ignored by Western governments, but they're bankrolling it using the taxes that we pay. It has to stop. And the last thing I wanted to say is a massive thanks to everyone on the panel. The activism that's being done is invaluable. Thank you.
Okay, I should have said, sorry, Nielsen will be the next speaker, and they'll be followed by Rob Ferguson.
Well, look, one of the things I think we have to grasp is that the Palestinian struggle is a living and breathing thing. We should remember the agency of the Palestinians in Palestine. Against all the odds, against the years of ethnic cleansing, apartheid, dispossession, and all the rest of it, the Palestinian people continue to fight back. When the world's media forgets about them, they let us know they're still there fighting. And that agency can shift the situation. Think about what happened in May 2021, last year. The general strikes, the uprising that Lowkey talked about, that changed the horizons of what's possible in that struggle. It tore up Netanyahu's plans for the region. Netanyahu thought he had silenced the Palestinian question for decades. The Palestinians fought back, and they've helped push Netanyahu out. But also think about what it's meant for the leadership of the Palestinian struggle. It has put forward the idea that the Palestinians don't have to settle for what the Palestinian Authority does. They don't have to settle for the rotten politics of Fatah. A new layer of Palestinian leadership has emerged. People like Mohammed al-Kurd, and I know that Ilan will talk about it in the session he does after this break. What does that mean for us then? What does it mean for what we do here in Britain? we have to do a number of things. One, we have to call Israel out for what it is. We have to say it's apartheid. We have to say that the Amnesty Report, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, they are tools in our arsenal to call out the Israeli state for what it is. Secondly, we have to keep building solidarity. We have to refuse to be silenced. In our universities, in our political organizations, in our trade unions, we have to keep flying the flag for Palestine. But the third thing, and the hardest thing, is we have to think, how does that feeling of solidarity, how can we map that, how can we turn that into a strategy for liberation? And I think that means recognizing that Palestine is the key for unlocking the whole prism of imperialism in the region. That means we have to fight the imperialists here at home and the support they give for Israel, but it also means we have to stand squarely in solidarity with the mobilizations from below in the region that can question the whole prism of imperialism. And that means it's an important fight, but it's one that we have to recognize is one that will be central in the months and years to come.
Thanks, Lewis. Rob is going to be the last speaker. Sorry to those other people who wanted to speak. We want to make sure that the panel have time to come back on the interesting discussion. Thank you.
Next week, we're expecting the government to table legislation banning public institutions, local authorities, universities, student unions, and so on, from making decisions on boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The real battle, in terms of driving that bill forward, will come in September, at the beginning, by the way, of the academic year. There's been a coalition formed, initiated by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I'm on the mobilizing committee, where we're aiming to drive the campaign down to the roots of workplaces, trade unions, universities, and so forth. There's a statement that has now been issued, which is on righttoboycott.org UK, a statement opposing the legislation, signed by all the major trade unions, including Unite, Unison, NEU, UCU, RMT, and so on, supported by Liberty, obviously all the Palestinian organizations, CND, Institute of Race Relations, Muslim Association of Britain, Quakers, Stop the War Coalition, and I could go on a long list. The point of highlighting that is that Shah Abbas Salama, in the speech that we heard at the beginning, said Palestine has no borders. Well, it has no borders for us, and it has no borders for them, because that legislation will not only ban decisions over boycott and divestment on Palestine, but on fossil fuels, the arms trade, fair trade, and so forth. And therefore, all these organizations, including Greenpeace, etc., have come together to oppose the legislation. And we need to take it down into the roots of the movement. The parliamentary arithmetic is that the legislation will go through. But we've got a different arithmetic. The arithmetic of those great May demonstrations and the spontaneous protests across the country, of school students painting their faces and raising the flag of Palestine. They might get their bill through, but they won't stop the movement. And we need to drive the movement through to raise the cry, like we did in May. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
Thank you so much. So now I'm going to bring in the panel back for about 5 minutes each, and I'm going to start with Ilan. Over to you.
Thank you. Let me start briefly with a question. I think you read it loud, right?
Yeah.
You read the question. What is the role of the Israeli left? It's a kind of an eternal question, is what is left of the Israeli left? And the answer is not very much. And every meeting we have here, there's even less of the left. Now, I think that what we really have to appreciate and accept that one can liberate Palestine without the Israeli left. And it would be good if the Israeli left would be part of the liberation movement nonetheless. But it's not a precondition to have in Israel, among the Jewish community, a large or even a small section who believe in liberation. This is not a precondition, but it is an added value. As we know, for many years, one of the reasons many, not people in this room, I'm sure, but people around the world found it difficult to deal with the phenomenon called the Israeli left was that people did not accept that Zionism was settler colonialism and that Israel was an apartheid state. And therefore, the very oxymoron of a leftist colonizer, a progressive ethnic cleanser, and an enlightened occupier was accepted, especially among social democratic parties around the world and in the West. So I think what we are looking into now in Israel is a group of young Israeli Jews who are a very small minority, but hopefully they will grow, who are endorsing two agendas which are very important. One is that they have a role to play in the decolonization of Palestine, coming from the comfort zone of the colonialist society. And that's not easy, but they are there. Not necessarily everyone who is against the occupation of 1967 fully understands that, because unfortunately, some of the very positive forces which want to end the Israeli occupation of 67 want to maintain the racist Jewish state of Israel. So we are looking for braver, younger generation of Israeli Jews who understand what decolonization means and what the role that they are playing. And secondly, and no less important, I think they know that they are part of an international effort of decolonization, not only of Palestine, but also of places such as Britain, because we have such a long work to do, a lot of work to do to decolonize our societies. Just final point about the legislation against the BDS, because it came up again and again. This is a great achievement that after 120 years of lobbying for Zionism, the Israeli government needs to use money, influence, manipulation, fabrication that can galvanize the political elite, but not the people itself, to try and stop words and actions of support for the Palestinians. That means that the BDS is a great success if the only way to stop it is through legislation. And we know that legislation would not stop any struggle for justice. We should be prepared for the next stage. We should not cave in. We should be actually proud and energized by the fact that we will have our time in the parliament, in the courthouse, in the media, to explain what the media tries to hide or is not interested in. That every day a young Palestinian boy or man or woman is being killed by the Israeli forces, that Israel encourages the level to increase the level of crime amongst the Palestinians in Israel in order to make them leave, that the ethnic cleansing continues in the south of Hebron, in the greater Jerusalem area, in the Nakab, in the Jordan Valley. We should exploit every debate we have on BDS, not to justify BDS, but to tell the public you have no idea what goes on in Palestine, and which is supported by your government, by your industry, one of the worst cases of injustice that has been continuing for ages and which was started by your own policy. So I hope we will all be there in the battlefield for Palestine. Thank you.
Right, well, I'd like to welcome Lowkey back to have his 5 minutes.
Hi. So what I would love to speak about is this question of what took place in the schools here post the May 2021 uprising. So at that time, Gavin Williamson, who is emotionally pro-Israel, of course, a member of the Conservative Friends of Israel, as Education Secretary, sent a letter to every single headmaster or headmistress or head teacher in the country stating that in order to deal with the uptick in anti-Semitism, which essentially was, as was stated before, a beautiful, the fact is there was a beautiful outpouring of solidarity with the Palestinians, which of course was in many cases disfigured in presentation as somehow being anti-Semitism. Now, supposedly to deal with that, Gavin Williamson suggested an organization by the name of Solutions, Not Sides. Now, myself and several others have investigated this organization for at least a year now. And what we found is actually quite intriguing. So the organization is a project of One Voice, which was founded by Daniel Lebetsky, himself on the board of the Israel Policy Forum and the ADL. The ADL, by the way, was an organization that FBI internal memos questioned whether it violated US law in terms of Foreign Agents Registrations Act, and the FBI memo said it is incredible to assume that the ADL is not furnished to an official of the Israeli state. And this was back in the 60s. But Daniel Lebetsky and his organization, One Voice, he's been quite clear, is about combating BDS. And he said in an interview with him that I was fighting BDS before people knew what BDS was, and that One Voice is one of the best tools to undermine BDS. So now One Voice comes around with this project called Solutions, Not Sides. And Solutions, Not Sides is about pushing this idea of coexistence being the answer to an uneven military equation, that somehow what's not happening is people are not speaking to each other, and it's not about a difference in political, military and economic power. Now, I have done a deep investigation into at least 50 employees of One Voice, and I have found that 28 of them were formerly employed by the Israeli military and or Israeli intelligence. What I also found was that there were 3 employees of One Voice who, simultaneous to working for it, were working for the Israeli government, including someone who worked at the Israeli embassy in London at the same time as working for One Voice here. So what Solutions Not Sides does as a project of One Voice is it goes into British schools and it encourages children who it targets and imagines to be more likely to be pro-Palestinian. It targets Muslim children and encourages them to see the other side, quote unquote, the other side of the debate. We have evidence of it getting children to pose with Israeli flags. And this has been rolled out across the country since May 2021. Solutions Not Sides, of course, had a presence in this country pre the Unity Intifada, but since then it has been intensified massively in terms of its funding. A lot of it comes from the British government, but also historically we've found funding from several key Israel lobbyists in this country, like Trevor Chin, who also funds Keir Starmer, of course. But we've also found other funders who are simultaneous to funding this organization, funding the building of settlements in the West Bank, funding the building of settlements in Jerusalem, and also funding the Friends of the IDF. So one could be forgiven for looking at this evidence and saying that there is a significant operation being carried out in British schools in order to astroturf a sort of normalization. And on top of it, essentially, this is a behavioral change program. Now, what we have in the NEU is recently the voting for of BDS, and that's what all of this legislation that we're seeing here is essentially about. It's about knocking back that bottom-up push for Palestinian rights and the pursuit of it through peaceful means like BDS. And so it's absolutely important that people are aware to what some of these operations in the schools are about, and that we organize the communication of that information as clearly as possible, and realize that what's being done in this country is very, very multi-layered and multifaceted and sophisticated, and our response to it has to also be sophisticated too. All in all, to wrap up, I would say there are victories which we have to appreciate and things that we have to be proud of, but we also must be aware that those victories are attritional, and we have to continue to push and fight every single step of the way.
Thank you. I think it's been a great meeting. Just before Sophia sums up, this event has been organised by the Socialist Workers' Party. If you like what you've heard, please join us. And there are team members at the back of the room, etc., who you can talk to about that. Thank you, Sophia.
Yeah, I just thought it might be quicker, given we're going over time anyway. I'll be brief, comrades. Yeah, Lowe, is that all right? Well, thank you everyone for the discussion, and yeah, once again to Ilan and Lowkey. I mean, it's clear from what we've spoken about, isn't it, that Israel has tried everything in its power to try and completely erase Palestinian identity and history. So much so that it erases it off maps. People may be aware of an organization called Birthright, which takes Jewish children to Israel. Obviously, you can tell by the name. It's an incredibly Zionist and anti-Palestinian organization. On the maps that they give them to those people, West Bank, Gaza, Palestine, they don't exist in these places. But, they try and erase it so much so, as I think the comrade over here was talking about, with the taking down or the banning of the Palestinian flag at Shireen's funeral. So much so that a Palestinian flag cannot be flown. I mean, these are the kind of attacks, but also I think it shows the power that the Palestinian flag has. Because whenever anyone flies that flag, it is an act of resistance, isn't it? It is about a call for liberation and against apartheid. And do you know what? I think it's quite clear to me, hopefully clear to other people in this room, that the extent of the racism of the Israeli system and the utter sheer brutalness of apartheid is that actually what side you're on really matters, doesn't it? Because some people maybe in this room, they might think that there's a path to solution which is via two states. There can be no two states. The two-state solution is dead. The Israeli state murdered it when they went, past the 1993 Oslo Accords. But actually, the two-state solution is unachievable and undesirable. Firstly, it will never address the right to return to the 800,000 people who were displaced in 48 and the now 8 million Palestinian diaspora that there are across the world. But actually, it's undesirable because two states, in my eyes, doesn't make sense. Someone in the speech said, from the river to the sea. All of that land is Palestine. It is all stolen land. None of it is Israel. Cannot have two states. And I think we have to be clear, because actually we call for a one-state solution, don't we? And actually, if you're not with us on that, then I think you're with them. Lowkey actually spoke a little bit about schools and what we are facing here in Britain. I don't know if people remember, but actually after the explosion of solidarity that he spoke about, there were children who wore a face mask in their secondary school, and on their face mask it had a Palestinian flag. What was happened? They were told to remove the face mask, but even worse, the police were called on the children to speak to them, and they were told that they were anti-Semites. Now listen, do not get me started on police being called to people on children in schools. We know what happens. There is a session this evening to discuss state racism and child Q and getting police out of schools. But quite frankly, there is no place for people who support Palestine to turn here in Britain in the legal and the political system. Now look, we haven't spoken about the Labour Party that much today. I'm happy about that, to be honest, because they're irrelevant to the conversation now in Palestine, actually. The Labour Party does not stand with Palestine. They kick out people who talk about Palestine. There might be some of you in this room who are in the Labour Party. I'm telling you, in the SWP, we will not kick you out if you stand with Palestine. Actually, it is a condition of every single member of ours in the SWP to be unequivocally standing with Palestine every day, no matter what we do. So that's why I just want to finish with, look, it's not going to surprise you, but you should consider joining the Socialist Workers' Party. Some of you may not know that the SWP was founded by a man called Tony Cliff. He was a Jewish man born in 1917 in British Mandate Palestine. And the years that he spent growing up there formed his political experiences, formed the ideas that he had about the world. And actually, he left Palestine because of the horrible repression and the years of early Zionism. And he committed his life to fighting against apartheid in Israel. But he also committed his life to fighting for a better world and against capitalism, the one that produces imperialism and Palestine. And actually, Tony Cliff, he saw the need to organize and to build a revolutionary party. You know, we don't organize, we don't do this randomly. We do it because it matters to society, actually, because we need a party that can take on the power of the capitalist state and resist all of the ills of the system, from apartheid to abortion bans. And that's why we organize in this way. So I would really urge you, if you've agreed with what we said, to join us, because we will always stand on the side of the oppressed. I just want to finish with a quote from Karl Marx. It's my favorite quote. He said that philosophers have always sought to interpret the world, have only ever sought to interpret the world. The point, however, is to change it. And so it may seem like a big step, a big task to change the world and achieve the world that we try and talk about here at Marxism Festival, but it starts with a small step, like joining the SWP. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.